Siberia, one of the largest and coldest regions on the face of the earth, a frozen land where more than half the year is ruled by snow, and where in some places the temperature drops below -60 degrees. You can't help but ask yourself, how on earth do people manage to survive out here? Today it's easier than it once was. But just think, hundreds of years ago there were already people making a life in this frozen wilderness. In this video, I'm going to tell you how people survived in the Siberia of the 1800s. In the 1800s, Siberia's frozen wilderness was home to around 2.5 million people. Most of them were the descendants of ancestors who had lived there for thousands of years. They spent their days herding reindeer and fishing through frozen rivers. For them, the cold and the winter weren't hardships. They were simply a way of life. Some of these people had come from the western parts of Russia, hoping to claim land of their own. And others living in Siberia at the time were those who had been sent there in exile. Throughout the 1800s, more than 1 million people were banished to these frozen lands, some for various crimes, others purely for political reasons. Among them were names like Dostoevsky and Lenin. Siberia's unimaginable cold became the one thing all these people had in common. In Siberia, winter wasn't just a season. For those who lived there, it was a great test. And under a test this harsh, people naturally needed a home, somewhere to take shelter and protect themselves from the cold. The traditional log cabins built to survive these conditions were known as izbas. An izba was constructed entirely from hand-hewn logs of pine, larch, or spruce. Here's the interesting part. They didn't use nails or anything like that to hold the logs together. The logs were stacked so skillfully that once you stuffed a little moss or flax into the gaps, the biting cold outside could never make its way in. In fact, a well-built izba could stand for up to 500 years. Of course, building an izba in a climate like that was no easy task. It took great patience and effort. The logs were usually cut in winter, while the trees were dry, and then left to dry out for somewhere between 6 months and a year. More often than not, building an izba wasn't something a single family could manage on its own. When an izba was going up, many people from the village would pitch in and work together. The inside of an izba had a surprising simplicity to it. A typical izba was just a single room of about 25 square meters, and an entire family had to fit their whole life into that one room. They cooked in that room, sat in that room, worked in that room, and slept in that room. And the most important part of that room, as you might guess, was the stove. These massive masonry stoves, known as pech, looked nothing like the small iron stoves we picture today. Handcrafted from brick or clay, a pech could sometimes be large enough to take up 1/4 of the entire room. Back then, the stove meant so much to a Siberian that there was even a saying among the people, "The stove is our mother." There was a good reason the stove inside an izba was so large. The pech was lit just once a day, early in the morning. That huge mass of brick would soak up the heat of the fire deep inside itself, and thanks to that, it kept the room warm all day long, even through the coldest hours of the night. In an age with no electricity and no central heating, these stoves were a heat source like no other. Here's something even more interesting. People would sometimes sleep on top of the stove. That wide, warm brick surface on the upper part of the stove was the most prized bed in the house. On cold nights, around 6 people could sleep up on those bricks. This warmest corner of the home was usually given to the weakest and most vulnerable, the elderly and the children. These stoves had even become the source of a belief in Siberia. A Siberian, for instance, would believe these stoves had healing powers. The sick would lie down on the stove's warm surface hoping to recover. Many people even believed that a spirit lived inside the stove, watching over the home and the family. In Siberia, the second great struggle that came right after the cold was the problem of food. Since there was no market to run off to if your supplies ran out, people had to prepare and stockpile enough food to last the whole winter before the snow ever fell. Luckily, the Siberians' biggest problem, the freezing cold, turned into a helper at exactly this point. The fish people caught before winter, or the meat they tried to store, would freeze solid in the Siberian cold and be ready to keep. Siberia's brutal nature was, quite literally, an endless natural freezer. Came about, a Siberian dish that's still well known and popular today. For those who don't know, stroganina is made by slicing frozen fish into thin, long strips, and it's eaten raw, without any cooking. In fact, Václav Serashevsky, a Polish man exiled to the region in 1896 for his political activities, noted that this dish was one of the favorite, and also one of the healthiest, foods among the locals. For the indigenous peoples in the more northern parts of Siberia, reindeer were at the center of everything. The meat, milk, cheese, and fermented dairy products that came from reindeer were the locals' most important sources of nourishment. Foods like these were usually preserved by smoking, drying, or boiling, and soups made by boiling meat together with various vegetables and wild herbs were both nourishing for the people of that era and a way to warm up in the cold. Summers in Siberia were quite short, and these brief summer seasons were spent from start to finish preparing for winter. During the short summers, berries like blueberries, lingonberries, and cranberries were gathered and dried to be saved for winter. Wild herbs like thyme and chamomile were also among the plants people stored, both for their healing properties and for adding flavor to food. In these cold lands, it wasn't only people who lived. There were also creatures unique to the region. For example, the Sakha people, also known as the Yakuts, who lived in the wide valleys of the Lena River, raised a remarkably hardy breed of horse in this bitterly cold climate, the Sakha horse. The Sakha horse was no ordinary breed. Thanks to their thick coats and incredible toughness, they could survive even in cold that dropped below -60 degrees. Sakha horses were one of the most resilient horse breeds in the world. For the Yakuts, these horses, along with their cattle and reindeer, carried enormous importance. As for clothing, in the Siberia of that era, what you wore wasn't a matter of taste, but entirely a matter of survival. To protect themselves from the cold, people had no choice but to wear thick, durable furs. Daily life generally followed a certain routine. Early in the morning, the woman of the house would light the stove, and as it began to warm the room, she would set the frozen food out to thaw and knead dough to make bread. The men, meanwhile, would chop wood outside, tend to the animals, and fish through the frozen lake. The elderly would usually sit by the stove all day long, telling stories to their grandchildren. Back then, the only thing to do through the long winter nights was to listen to these stories. And these stories also passed knowledge and tradition down from one generation to the next. In those years in Siberia, a snowstorm would sometimes rage on for days, even weeks, without stopping. At times like that, it was impossible to so much as step outside. On days like those, the only thing to do was to gather around the stove and wait for the storm to die down. In the Siberia of that era, winter wasn't an enemy to be defeated, but a reality people had to learn to live alongside. People knew they couldn't stop the winter, so the wisest thing they could do was to make their preparations beforehand and learn to live in these cold lands. For generations in Siberia, people gathered around that great stove, told their stories, and held on to life. Siberia's cold climate led these people to build a way of life and a culture all their own. And those people became one of the greatest proofs that humankind can survive even in the places least suited to life. From deep within Siberia's frozen lands, a voice has been whispering the same thing to us for centuries. Life finds a way, even in the harshest of conditions,